Okay, great. Good morning to both of you.
Well,
So
good morning
on
to you.
we're now talking to Professor James Farrer and Dr. Chuanfei Wang, based in Sophia University, whose collaborative research focuses on the globalization of Japanese cuisine worldwide. Today, we're discussing their paper, Japanese Cuisine in Urban Chinese Foodways. So first of all, I would just like to say that I enjoyed reading your paper absolutely very much. It provides such a rich and vivid ethnographic materials to think about the changing foodscape in urban China. So I guess I'm going to start with the first question, which is the central question you address in the paper, and what is your answer to it?
Right. So I think most broadly speaking, the question is, how do foreign, I guess, foodways fit into Chinese foodways? So what is the position of foreign foods in China? And then what sorts of non-Chinese foods or foreign, what would be called labeled foreign foods are urban Chinese people eating? And then, historically and I guess sociologically, how did these types of foodscapes emerge in Chinese cities? So the focus being on urban foodscapes.
Yeah, we're also focused on, the food consumption in our paper. We try to argue that it's an expression of social status and class distinction. So another question that we try to ask is, why is Japanese at the top of this ranking, of this hierarchy? And what and how the Chinese people consume Japanese food in contemporary China.
So I think it's very interesting that you focus on Japanese cuisine because yeah, like you indicated in the introduction, a lot has been written about the reception of Chinese food abroad, and also like not so much about foreign foods and their reception in China. With only one exception might be McDonald's,
Right.
the whole thing about the fast food in the 1990s, but not so much on this type of Asian cuisine. So would you like to elaborate a little bit about this particular historical journey of Japanese food in China? Because that sort of it reflects the whole process of the Japanese food being incorporated into the local diet or local foodscape. Yeah.
Right. So I think that for us, when we're doing this, this is part of a project that's centered at Sophia University, which is not just about China, although I think China was the first place we really started this, but it's been looking at Japanese food really around the world. And we're working on a book on this. It covers actually every continent except Antarctica. But China is maybe the most interesting place because Japanese food is so incredibly popular in urban China. And one of the things that we got into was looking at sort of when this started. And I think this is one of the areas that was quite surprising because it's actually has a very deep history. And so some of the earliest Japanese restaurants in Shanghai go all the way back to the 1880s. And then in places like Tianjin and other cities also, as in the late Qing, you already have these Japanese food towns emerging. And that's something we only get into a bit in this paper, but by the 1930s, these are really elaborate, very large sort of urban food scenes, and they center to a great extent on the Japanese population, but Chinese people interact with them a great deal all the way through the 1930s, and even during the wartime, and even in the post-war period, which was even more surprising that the last Japanese restaurants we can find operating in Shanghai was as late as 1951 and 52. So, they were really kind of, even after the war, there were still people going to these places. So that I think was a fascinating part of this story for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the surprising detail we could have encountered in there because it's actually after the founding of the PRC, the people are still consuming Japanese food until the states sort of, I assume, shut it down.
Right, and that's it's not that easy to find really detailed materials. There's some, in the book we're working on it, we introduced a few more ethnographic pieces from newspapers at the time, and to some extent it was really the late, Republican period in the 1940s, 45 to 49, where you get more material. It's clear that this sort of lasted on. There's some really interesting and tantalizing details in there, but I don't know if we can make too much out of them. There maybe have been a few Japanese people still in Shanghai already as late as 1951 working in these restaurants, at least according to the advertisements the restaurants have. But I think that's something it's a little bit difficult to get into without finding more data.
So perhaps the sheer absence of the data speaks volume about the place of Japanese cuisine during, socialist period, I assume.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think they were closed down by 52. So it's quite early that they really were closed down.
But we find that the first Japanese restaurant reopened in China, at least in Beijing, after the Cultural Revolution, was probably as early as 1980s. That's what we found in the newspaper, in the Japanese newspaper.
Well, I think that's perhaps one of the greatest contribution of your paper to the whole understanding of modern contemporary Chinese foodways when it involves the foreign elements. Because when I was trying to read more about that, I found that a lot have been written about Western restaurants, either in the colonial or, the pre-20th century period, the late imperial time, and also during the socialist period. So a lot have been written about the Western, but not like the Asian foodways, especially in association with Japan. Would you like to say a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, especially the contemporary period, there were just sort of two facts that I think people might have some idea about. But when we were looking at you look at the most common website in China for food, for food reviews, which is Dianping. And then you look on Dianping and you see that the most popular foreign restaurant by far is Japanese food. In fact, it's almost as popular in Shanghai as every other type of foreign food combined. And by some counts, you could say there might be more Japanese restaurants in Shanghai than in any other city in the world outside of Japan. And Tianjin, and so actually every Chinese city has just a large number of Japanese restaurants. The other fact is that if you look at the priciest restaurants, or the most expensive restaurants in Chinese cities, Japanese restaurants are a very big chunk of that. And in this paper, we look only at Tianjin and Shanghai, but if you were to look at other cities in China, you find a similar pattern. So it's it's very common and popular and varied, and also kind of occupies a niche at the very top. And I think for us, that was somewhat surprising, the extent to which Japanese cuisine is sort of rebounded in a sense. And also why sort of the position it occupies.
You introduced Japanese restaurants and the foodways in two cities, Shanghai and Tianjin. So could you tell us a bit more about the similarities and disparities between the two cases, and then together what kind of story they tell? I was really interested in some of the ethnographic details. It seems that from the data you provide, there is a more pronounced gendered dimension about izakaya in Tianjin than in Shanghai. Is that the way it is, or is it more like to do with the data representation and also the gendered aspects of the researchers?
Right. That might be, since I did a lot of the Shanghai field work and Chuanfei did the Tianjin field work, although Chuanfei spent a considerable amount of time in Shanghai. So I think maybe you could speak to this question, Chuanfei.
I think at least in today's Tianjin, Japanese food really represents a new pattern of subculture, and especially the feminized consumption culture. In the restaurant type of izakaya, that's a gastropub, it's like English pub. In Tianjin, this type of restaurant is very interesting. Is that it's different from how the Japanese people use the space. In Tianjin, it's a much more female oriented space. For example, the two cases that I introduced in our paper. What really impressed me during my field work is that I saw almost every customer was Chinese women, and they consume in small group between 2 or 3 people. And especially when I did my interview and field work, it was quite late at night. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening. So people went to those izakaya, and they felt like that's a safe place for them to consume, to dine out in the late night. So that's, I think it's a new type of culture occurred in the space of izakaya.
That's absolutely fascinating, because that's the beauty of comparison, because you put two cases together and then the difference really stands out, and then sometimes that difference speaks volume about the varied stories and trajectory of the same cuisine in different localities. And there is also one detail pointing to the food itself. The sensory and visceral aspects of the food. And then how does that tie into the overall argument, which is more on the symbolic level, because you're arguing presumably the association between the Japanese cuisine and social distinction. Like the Japanese cuisine is a very powerful status marker in contemporary China. And that kind of is more on the symbolic kind of dimension, but also there is the visceral aspect, in the sense that Japanese cuisine are popular because they are more easily received by Chinese people, with the similarity of the rice and then everything, and also the health benefits or perceived health benefits. So my question is like how do the two aspects link with each other? If that's clear.
Well, yeah, I kind of want to speak to that just a bit. I think one thing about this is that and it links back to gender dimension, as women have become more important as consumers and also as decision makers in eating. So I think even in Shanghai, I'd say women often are more likely to be decision makers, like where you're going to go on a date or something. And I think women are choosing they have slightly different priorities in eating. And this is not unique to China. So when we look at the globalization of Japanese food, I think women have led this in many cases, and this health dimension, or at least the reputed healthiness and lightness of Japanese food, have been a factor. So in Europe as well, I think in China that's similar, that women are looking at this as a lighter kind of food, and that's part of that visceral nature, but it's also part of the symbolic nature because it's related to being healthy and dieting and all that lifestyle issues. And then the closeness of this to Chinese food is important, and it's important also globally, because if you go to the New York City, for example, you'll see the high-end Japanese restaurants have a very high proportion of Asian customers who are often Chinese. So there is a kind of globalization of this as this kind of connection. And I think even you could say a gender dimension at all levels of it as well. So I think that there's also something, and I think it comes out in Chuanfei's research in Tianjin about drinking culture and about how women approach drinking culture rather differently than men as well.
I want to mention probably another factor. I think it's very related to the consumption of the Japanese food in China by women. This is a WeChat, a online consumption era that everybody go to restaurants before they eat the food. take a photo of everything on the table, right? And Japanese food represents the aestheticism of beautiful food, not only palatable, palatable pleasure, but also invisible pleasure. So I think this WeChat, outside China is the Instagram, Twitter culture also affects, the way women consume the Japanese food, and Japanese food exactly fits the need that they can provide visually beautiful things on the social media.
It's almost like there's it's something inherent about the Japanese cuisine, like the focus on the freshness of the ingredients, and also the visual presentation of the food, like in kaiseki cuisines. It's being developed by people in China and also worldwide, and further, and to attach more meanings to it, and that meanings sort of include the social distinction and also cosmopolitanism, presumably.
Yeah, and like social media is the easiest way, to represent this kind of social distinction, right? So food, Japanese food, provides just an accessible way to do it.
I think that's brilliant, because just from the discussion earlier, ongoing discussion, and then you were talking about women becoming the decision maker, and then that's quite similar to the story of fast food in China. Like it has to do with children becoming the center of the decision making, and in the case of Japan, you find a new rising group of consumers with more economic power to decide, and a social space to decide what to eat. So to what extent does that sort of parallel relevant to the point you were making?
Well, I would say it's quite relevant, because I think that the people that took on Japanese food as adults were the same people that had eaten a lot of fast food as children. So, and I think there's certain dimensions of this that are similar and homogeneous. There's a certain sort of logic of individualism. So when Yan Yinshang talks about fast food, he talks about the logic of individualism. But I think Japanese food has really brought the logic of individualism to fine dining as well. And not merely in China, but I think in China very dramatically, because fine dining in a Chinese context was about a banquet and sharing food with 10 people, and a man treating all of his subordinates or colleagues or family members, showing his generosity, and usually a him, right? But Japanese food, in the way it's developed, has been focused on a counter seating, very individualized portions. You could even go completely by yourself. It is often in its contemporary form not associated with dining in a large scale. So it's often a very small scale thing, 1 or 2 people. It's very much a more, I guess, egalitarian in a sense, while at the same time it can be very snobbish, so you're all sitting at the counter, but you're all sort of spending a lot of money together at the counter. So it's a within the group, there's not a lot of social distinction, although there's a social distinction with people who are not able to afford to come to that place, maybe, or get a reservation at that place. So I think that sort of thing has really I think that appeals to young people who want to have, a kind of broader sense of social distinction, but not necessarily doing the kind of guanxi, creating connections and social capital that would have been associated with the Chinese banquet. And it's also faster, potentially. You can eat sushi super fast. So it's suited for a very modern type of lifestyle. And I think that there's an association then with fast food and the way modern Japanese food has developed over time, not necessarily, the way it would have been eaten in the past,
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a Japanese cuisine is used by a particular group of middle-class urbanized young people to sort of redefine what it means to be middle class and to be a cosmopolitan person in high social status?
Well, I think we have to clarify that the cases that we introduced in our article is that Japanese food is not only the expensive cuisine in China. It's at all levels of rankings in the restaurant category. And Japanese food is consumed by urban Chinese from all walks of life. You can find the most expensive one, the so-called elite Chinese people to go and dine there. But you can also find, some like very casual Japanese food stand where the middle school students just go buy for snack food after school. So it's not, we're not trying to say, Japanese cuisine, the consumption of Japanese cuisine, it's elite middle class culture, but it's an urban middle and probably upper middle class consumption culture.
That's great for the clarification, because when I was, my research sort of touched upon the same kind of set of issue, which that has to do with urban young people, middle class. Because I looked at foodism in Beijing, and one of my conclusion is that this group of people, they are very high in cultural capital, but not so much economic capital. So does it? So I might be stretching my own opinion onto your data, but it seems that in Tianjin especially, that people are Japanese cuisine or Japanese restaurant hold a lot of cultural capital for these people, and they are inexpensive. So a group of people growing up in this upper middle class or even middle class culture, pop culture, and they know they have this window to the world outside, and then they know that they have the cosmopolitan aspiration, so they are rich in cultural capital, but they don't have that much money to afford very expensive cuisine. But by consuming this inexpensive Japanese little izakaya places, they are sort of recovering what it means to be middle class. So you don't have to be loaded to be middle class, but you can display your middle classness through, particular cultural tastes. That's just my reading, but I'm not sure if that's that's the same kind of thoughts that you have in this paper.
At least in my observation and field work, the people that I talked to, I don't think they are kind of people, who only have cultural capital without economic capital. I think they're well-off people, and they could afford, journeys to Japan and even study in Japan. But Japanese cuisine, like other Japanese popular culture, is just another alternative to the Western culture. It's not the type of culture that people without economic power to show their aspiration of becoming a middle class. At least in my field work, I didn't see that point. I just see Japanese culture is an alternative to other types of foreign culture.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you bring out. It's almost certainly the case that, to some extent, that I would tend to think it is the case that people do this, that urban people consume this type of culture almost unconsciously in order to distinguish themselves from people who are not urban. And I think that, so I think what Chuanfei is saying is, I agree with it. For a large part of our fieldwork, I think people, there's actually a lot of consumption involved in this. And in fact, travel is a big part of it for the somewhat well-off people. And because Japan is so close, they're able to generate a rather dense type of cultural capital associated with Japan. Much more, it's not that casual. It can be, because they've been there and they've eaten things. They've also consumed Japanese culture. So it's actually quite, there's a lot of it, in fact. But even for the people, I think your view is somewhat plausible, and I think people in general, urban people, want to be sophisticated. And I think that they're distinguishing themselves from eating really ordinary foods. And I think that that's something that when I talk to people in restaurants, it seemed to be the case. Mind you, I mean, we did a lot of research with the producers and owners of these restaurants as well.
Mm.
And so, I mean, we probably got closer to the crowd who's deeply committed to this type of consumption, right? I think we had a lot of contact with people like that.
That's great. I think yeah, that was a very engaging conversation we just had. I think we covered all of the main points we would like to capture in this interview.